Hello, everybody. This is Ari Dugnov speaking, and welcome to my class on the history of Zionism. This is the recording of session 3, which is entitled Varieties of Russian Zionism Before Herzl. In this session, we will be discussing several key texts. Among them is Leo Pinsker's famous tract Autoemancipation, and I would like to say also a few words about the role of pogroms in the history of Zionism. But above all, the aim of today's session is to prepare you to the three primary texts that will stand at the center of our class discussion. Yuda Leib Gordon's two poems, Awake My People and For Whom Do I Toil, from the 1880s and 1870s, the Bilu Manifesto, and Chaim Nachman Bialik's famous 1903 poem on the city of slaughter. We've discussed earlier this semester about the need to understand Zionism in various contexts as something that takes place both in Middle Eastern history and in European history, and is also part of nationalism studies. In a way, today's class, we will be moving between a very European and more precisely an East European context, and we'll try to see how it has its first effects on the history of what we would later call the first aliyah, the first wave of Zionist immigration. We've already discussed in previous lessons the Pale of Settlement, the Chota Ostolsti, as it's called in Russian, or Der Tchum HaMoshav in Yiddish, this famous vast area in which a Jewish settlement was permissible in Russia, in which roughly 95% of the total Jewish population of Russia resided, and almost all of them were Yiddish speakers. I would like to focus to bring us back to that area, because this is sort of the stage for so many of the events that we will be discussing today. In this map you can see before you, you can see several different colors. The glossary of the colors is the following. The areas that are marked in pink or pinkish orange color are the areas that Jews were allowed to reside. They do not correspond the borders of the Russian Empire with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, or East Prussia as it was called at that time. And you can see that in the yellow areas, Jews were not allowed to reside because of its proximity to the border, and the same applies to the green area where Jews could reside only in major cities, but not in the countryside. And this is a vast area that includes the area that is called Belarus, literally White Russia, and Novorossiya, literally the New Russia, which is that a new provincial province Russia formed in the late 18th century, which was very important for it due to its proximity to the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula. And I would like you to remember this area because after World War I, and as we are progressing into interwar periods and into World War II, this would become what the Yale historian Timothy D. Snyder called Bloodlands, a vast area between Germany and Russia that would include the new states that were created after World War I, such as Poland, the Ukraine, the Baltic region states, and Belarus, and they will become the sites of horrific political programs of the Soviets, and later where the Nazis would conduct their most dreadful systematic annihilations of Jews throughout this very elaborate system of concentration camps with the help of locals. The fact that today often local governments would prefer to airbrush. So it's a very it's an area that has a very bitter memory in Jewish history in general and for the local population as well. But I would like to remind everyone that this was still considered the periphery of Imperial Russia, and the borders would later on, after World War I, start changing, shifting very quickly, excuse me. And as you probably might have heard, a famous joke about the Jew from Galicia who says, I was born in Austro-Hungary, after that I grew up in Poland, then in Germany, after that in the USSR, to which someone replied, oh, you must have traveled a lot. And the Jew simply replied, nope, I stayed put. It was simply borders that were constantly changing. Looking at the map, you might understand where this joke emerges from. Soon enough, we will focus on one city in particular that you can see highlighted in the map here, Kishinev, or as it is called today, Chisinau. Today it's the capital and the largest city of the Republic of Moldova, then still part of the Pale of Settlement in its southern area. And in the late 19th century, roughly 45-46% of the population of Kishinev was Jewish, a population of roughly 50,000 people. Now, we are using the term Pale of Settlement, but actually the name Pale is actually very modern and is related in a way to the topic of our discussion today, because it enters into English very late, actually only in 1903, against the backdrop of the horrific event that we will discuss today, the Kishinev Pogrom, that will become also the background to Bialik's famous poem. Now, why is it called a Pale? The name itself is an analogy. It's named after the Pale, the Irish Pale, or what sometimes is referred as the English Pale, which appears already in the 15th century. It's the area in Ireland that was directly under the control of the English government in the late Middle Ages. So why on earth there is a term that originates in Ireland that is suddenly applied on that vast area? The analogy is actually a product of a journalistic imagination. It is introduced by Michael Davitt, an Irish Republican and agrarian campaigner who founded the Irish National Land League, and he's the one that published in 1903 a book that is entitled Within the Pale, the true story of anti-Semitic persecutions in Russia. And from there, the term enters into circulation in the English press and enters the English language. So this was actually a series of reports made by him originally for American newspapers in 1903. He was sent to report about the pogroms and the Kishinev pogroms. He traveled to Russia to investigate that incident. So in a way, you have here a journalist that coins a term that would make this vast area more comprehensible for English readers. But more than any other books, it was this Irish Republican who helped popularizing this kind of a notion of the Pale that is the term that we are using to this day. So if Pale of Settlement is one of the key words we will be mentioning today, another second word is pogrom. And what is a pogrom? So in a way, a pogrom is a word that is used today to describe any type of organized massacre of a particular group, usually an ethnic group, and often it was used against the Jews of Russia or Eastern Europe, but over the years it was also applied to other cases. But actually the etymology of the term is also taking us back to a very Russian context. It is derived from the common prefix po and the verb gromit, and which means in Russian to destroy, to wreak havoc, but actually grom is the Russian word for thunder. So its literal translation is either to harm like a thunder, to strike like a thunder. And it makes, in a way, a term that makes an implicit analogy between a human violence and some sort of natural outburst or eruption, something which is as if it's not man-made. Now, I am taking a few minutes to think about the meaning of the term and its origins, because in a way that's part of the problem. The Russian state authorities preferred to present the violent riots which aimed at the massacre or expulsion of Jews as something that emerged in a spontaneous way, as a grassroots a movement and expression of a natural resentment in which the state authorities have nothing to do, and so on. It was also easy for them to turn a blind eye, send the troops in to calm and bring back peace, and only blame either the poor peasants or, if you like, often the Jews themselves for being massacred by their neighbors. Now, the term, as I mentioned, traveled over time to different places, and those of you who will study, for instance, deadly religious ethnic riots in remote areas such as India and Pakistan will see, for example, how the locals are using this term pogrom that is borrowed for Jewish context and is applied on riots and deadly riots there. Now, it is understood generally, as I mentioned today, as any type of communal violence against any ethnic group or religious group, not only against the Jews. But this is also a reminder for me to tell you, look at dictionaries. And when we're looking as historians at dictionaries, we need to look not only at the definition, but, as you can see from the slide before you, also at that amazing thing that is called the etymology. That excellent dictionaries such as the infallible Oxford English Dictionary, you can see here before you, provides you a wonderful tool to trace the entry of these terms into our everyday language. So you can see here also another proof that this is what we would call today a loan word, a term that was used to describe a case, one case, but it is adopted from one language. Sometimes it's called the donor language, and then it's incorporated into another language without translation, as is. And why is that? Because often people would like to keep that sort of a original taste or atmosphere, which is culture and specific to regional connotations associated with the word original. So what we saw here is example of two key buzzwords in Jewish history that are both type of loan words. The Pale, which originates in a very Irish context and is applied on the Jews of Eastern Europe, and the pogroms that are originated in Eastern Europe and traveling the other way in the opposite direction to Western Europe and the United States. This is also a reminder for me that when we are historians, we can treat dictionaries that provide us this etymology in a way as almost a primary source in themselves. If our project is to understand how words emerge and to trace their history and to try to put a date of birth, at least the minute they enter into modern languages, the dictionaries in a way start functioning almost as primary sources. So after we understood these two key buzzwords, let's talk a bit about the political political organizations that were founded among Jews against this background. And in the slide before you, you can see a photo of the delegates to the conference of the Chibat Zion movement that was founded in Katowice, Poland in 1884 against the background of those pogroms. In this photo, you can see one of the protagonists of our class today, Leo Pinsker, the author of the manifesto Autoemancipation. So what is exactly Chibat Zion or Bilu? So it was established, it was a movement that was established in Russia, and it also had roots in Romania during the early 1880s. In concept, and when concept promoting modern Jewish nationalism began to spread from intellectual circles and trickle down to the masses, and Chibat Zion literally means the love of Zion. And the Chibat Zion movement was considered today as the first, pre-official Zionist Jewish nationalist movement and the one that prepares the ground to the organized Zionist movement that will emerge in 1897 in Central and Western Europe. Its followers were often called Chovevei Zion, lovers of Zionism. And the founders of this movement were people like Peretz Smolansky, who we mentioned in previous classes, Moshe Leib Lilienboim, Eliezer Perlman, that later changed his name to Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who we will discuss as well. And they are already Russian Jews that during the 1860s and throughout the 1870s were not only well educated, but also started applying modern theories of nationalism to the conditions of the Jews in Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire. And they started arguing the Jews are a nation, and they started broke with the view that Jews are not solely members of religion, unfettered by any type of national or ethnic ties. We will discuss some of those figures also later on. Ben Yehuda, who we will discuss, for instance, asserted that the only place for the modern Jewish nationalism to truly take hold was the land of Israel, but not necessarily everyone agreed. And part of the debate we have among historians, to which I will allude very quickly, is whether Leo Pinsker, that published the manifesto Autoemancipation in 1882, necessarily claimed the same. But there's no doubt that Leo Pinsker, the physician, that offered this kind of a very well argued text, provided in a way sort of an impetus, and also provided the language for that movement that started to organize itself, as you can see here, in 1884 in the city of Katowice, where they started developing their program, leading to what is commonly referred today as the first aliyah. But there's not another additional very important context that is not solely Jewish, but is also a Russian context. And we have to say a few words about the very tumultuous political context of Tsarist Russia of those days that creates this drama. And here comes a key date that many historians tend to treat as almost a watershed moment in Jewish history, and that is the year 1882. Why is 1882 so important? If we'll look at Russian history in the second half of the 19th century, especially from the 1860s onward, you will see a growth in the calls for reform of the Tsarist empire, but also the emergence, especially as we're entering into the 1870s and the 1880s, of a much more radical revolutionary strand. And if you will ever study Russian history, you will learn, for instance, about the emergence of a movement that called themselves the Narodniks. Narod in Russian is people. So in a way, these are Russian populist, and they are the ones that became involved in revolutionary agitation against Tsarism. So they saw themselves as the people that are speaking on behalf of the masses. Again, Narodnik can be simply translated into modern English as sort of a populist. They were often well educated, trained in the universities that emerged in Russia, but they saw themselves as speaking on behalf of the people and also going to the people to educate them and told them about the new theories, and often these are the origins of the anti-Tsarist socialist ideas. Now, though there were some Jews among the Narodniks, this is not a Jewish movement. This is a Russian movement that is a very central movement in the history of the Russian intelligentsia, the new intellectual classes that were starting to promote anti-Tsarist ideas. They succeeded in assassinating Tsar Alexander II in March 1881. Tsar Alexander II was considered a relatively more open-minded and liberal Tsar, but after the persecution, the Russian authorities moved into very different directions, and perhaps the first to see the blow and the reaction were the Jews. The assassination of Alexander II opened the gates of hell for many of the Jews. It was followed by a wave of attacks against the Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement, which today, in retrospect, we would call pogroms. Immediately in April 1881, you will see the first wave of those pogroms. The fact these pogroms are taking place in the spring around the time of the Christian Easter and the Jewish Passover is not coincidental. And in the most part, these pogroms emanated in larger cities and then started spreading out to smaller villages and smaller towns in the countryside. Now, you shouldn't confuse the pogroms of the 1880s with the later waves of pogroms in 1903, 1905, and so on. And of course, after the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, during the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, you will have another horrendous wave of pogroms. In comparison, the pogroms of 1881 and 1882 were usually directed against Jewish property and less against the individuals, though there were approximately, from what we could find from the historical records, roughly 50 casualties. But what is not less important is not only the harm that was done to individuals and Jewish property, but the legal aspects of the 1881 and 2. Because part of what happened, and this is where a key figure or villain in the story enters the picture, is that the Tsarist authorities appointed a new figure, Count Nikolai Pavlovich Ignatieff, the gentleman you can see on the right side of the slide. And Ignatieff was a reactionary, pan-Slavist, very iron fist kind of a diplomat and statesman. And he played a major role in the administration after the assassination of Alexander II. He was immediately appointed the Minister of Interior, and in a way he was the architect of the May Laws. What were exactly the May Laws? The May Laws were a series of regulations that were supposed to be temporary, and these even created more restrictions on Jews in terms of their where they're allowed to reside, where they the professions they are allowed to pursue, and so on and so forth. Moreover, we know that the Count Ignatieff also even played with the idea of having an extensive project of transferring the Jews to the plains of Central Africa, of Asia, for settlement on the land. And in the eyes of many, he embodies the image of that wild Russian bear that was never pacified until he would see the last Jew leaving Russia or simply killed. And this is why he became sort of one of the so-called villains of Jewish history. Those of you who might be familiar with modern Canadian history might know the name of Michael Ignatieff, the famous academic, journalist, and former leader of the official opposition in Canada. This is his direct great-grandson. But while Michael Ignatieff, the Canadian, is a soft-spoken, great liberal, his great-grandfather was notoriously known as a reactionary and anti-Semitic statesman. And most crucially, in addition to making life extremely hard for the Jews in the Russian Pale of Settlement, he permitted for the first time immigration from Russia to the West in the years 1881, 1882. This, of course, started a domino effect. Some of you may be familiar with these type of photos, And the major effect of the May laws was, of course, that the Jewish Russian population started immigrating en masse, and it opened an influx of immigration. This mass immigration is of scales that are really breathtaking. We know that between 1881 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, more than 2.5 million Jews left their homes in Eastern Europe. Now, just to clarify, Russian Jews number approximately 4 million at the time, and they themselves constituted more than 50% of the global Jewish population at the time. So what you see here is a major reshifting of the center of gravity of world Jewry in terms of it, in geographical terms. Now, what is also very important to remember is that only a tiny, tiny trickle of these immigrants ended up in Palestine or even wished to travel to Palestine. The Golden Medina was and remains, as you probably guessed from this slide, the United States. And here you see one of those iconic images of immigrants coming through Ellis Island, landing in New York. So the pogroms and the May laws are important not only for the collective memory of Zionists in Israel, but also, if you'd like, for so many New York Ashkenazi Jews that can still trace their grandparents' routes back and itineraries back to the Pale of Settlement. The language of some history books and textbooks telling the story of American Jews and Zionist textbook in that respect can be similar. For that reason, the masses are regarded as refugees fleeing homes to find a safer and more secure existence in a new land, and they are driven out due to persecution, and they're attracted due to the promise of freedom to continue practicing their religion. So I'm putting our story not only in a very narrow Zionist history perspective, but would also like to remind you that this is part of this larger story in the shift of the center of gravity of Jewish history. It is precisely in this context that you will see the development of new ideas, and most primarily Pinsker's famous tract on Autoemancipation. We will discuss this text in greater detail in class, but what I would like to remind everyone is that it was a text that could be considered the first Zionist bestseller. It was a bestseller in the sense that it was translated into many languages, as you can see from the slide before you, and then spread very quickly. But I would also want to bring to your attention the fact that though it was written by a Russian Jew, it was actually written in German, and he writes in German as a Russischen Juden, and he emphasizes the fact that he's a medical doctor. When reading it, do pay attention to the fact that he's using this and think about why is he writing in this language. Self-presentation here is connected to the content. 70% of the text presents itself as almost a diagnostic text, an analysis of a disease that Jewish civic emancipation is seen as a failure, and the disease is, of course, given the name Judeophobia and is described as an eternal disease. You can see, for instance, some of the key ideas already illuminated in the paragraphs before you. The way in which Leo Pinsker is using the medical language, we will see something very similar when we'll discuss Max Nordau ideas later on. And he talks about and he presents his text as a diagnostic move. In a sick man, the absence of desire for food and drink, writes Leo Pinsker, is a very serious symptom, and in that same way, the Jew is in that unhappy condition of such a patient. Look also at the way in which talks about nativity. The Jew is nowhere at home, nowhere is regarded as a native, and also think about how he uses the term autoemancipation, that could be roughly translated into self-emancipation, to be contrasted with what he calls legal emancipation. For him, the legal emancipation of the Jew is the crowning achievement of the century, but it did not solve the problem because it's not a social emancipation. So we will like to understand what exactly is he means by social emancipation. For many, many years, most historians saw Pinsker's text as the first text that can really squarely be seen as the opening shot of the Zionist ideology, and also assumed that the project of self-emancipation could manifest itself only in Palestine and only by a creation of a Jewish state. Recent historiography starts challenging this teleological view that inclines to see autoemancipation through the prism of later ideas. And those of you who will read Dmitry Shumsky's article on Leo Pinsker and emancipation, he tries to run against that traditional reading of Pinsker and offer a reevaluation, and you can see how much he tries to fight those who are reading Herzl's ideas back into Pinsker's text. The project, Shumsky argues, that Pinsker was promoting was definitely not a nation-state project. He was thinking about types of territorial nationalism, but not the type of nation-state that we'll see developed later in Palestine. And I also want to remind us all that in our next sessions we will talk about alternative responses, such as the creation of the Bundist movement or the autonomous movement that was inspired by historian Simon Dubnov. These are different nationalist projects that are not Zionist, and they are thinking about the future of the Jews as a national group, but in Russia, without immigration, and we will discuss this in the future, so look forward to our next sessions. But if there is a very clear achievement of the Bilu movement, the Chovevei Tzion group, it is the establishment of a series of private Jewish agricultural colonies that were named in Hebrew Moshavot in the late 19th century, meaning still in late Ottoman Palestine. And you can see in the map before you some of those famous 7 first Moshavot. Petach Tikva, that is often still named Em HaMoshavot, literally the mother of all the Moshavot, was the first attempt to create a Moshava in 1878. This one failed, but then it was reestablished in 1882, that famous year that I've mentioned earlier, followed by Rishon LeZion, literally meaning in Hebrew the first for Zion, Rosh Pina, Zichron Yaakov, Ekron, that was later named Mazkeret Batya, Yesod HaMa'ala, Gedera. You don't need to memorize these names and definitely not the dates. I just want you to have this map in view, because this is what came to be known as the first wave or the first aliyah of Zionist settlement of Palestine. It is humble beginnings. Some will argue that it was almost entirely forgotten. Here you can see from the photo, for instance, one of those Moshavot, Ekron, and it is crucial to emphasize that they later grew into the backbone of a very successful citrus and wine industry in the mandatory period and even into early statehood years. But these early colonies were slightly different from the type of settlements we will see emerging after 1904 under the influence of the labor Zionist movement. I would like also to remind everyone that these first colonies are crucial for debates among historians today about the question whether Zionism is a form of settler colonialism, yes or no. For example, if you read Gershon Shafir's classic book Land, Labor on the Origins of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, he begins his story exactly in 1882 with these type of colonies. This is where he finds the origins of a local conflict between European settlers and the Palestinian Arab population. I would also want to bring to your attention the fact that the name itself, first aliyah or first wave of aliyah, is of course problematic and was coined only in retrospect, the same way that the First World War didn't know its first until there was another second catastrophe. The first aliyah was often belittled by later so-called proponents of the second aliyah and the third aliyah that were socialists, and they regarded them as sites of conservative politics, even lacking a proper strong Zionist ideology, resisting the socialist ethos, and so on and so forth. And I would allude to it later. And for instance, the fact that they were private agriculturalists and the fact that they depended on external philanthropy was very highlighted in the way they were remembered in Israel. There is a huge role that was played in these colonies, for instance, by Baron Edmund de Rothschild and his son James in the Jewish settlement. Baron Rothschild was nicknamed Hanadiv Hayadua, which literally translates as the famous philanthropist. And it is also the period in which the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association emerged. It would be dismantled only many years later in 1957. And in this slide you can see an image of a reproduction of a very old 500 shekel bill. It's already long out of circulation. Today the currency is the new Israeli shekel, but in that old bill you can see Rothschild portrait. And if you look carefully at the imagery at the background, you can see that the settlers of the first aliyah and also the famous wine industries that were set up by the Rothschilds, and the type of bureaucracy that they set up, agencies that they created to channel their philanthropic contribution into specific projects. And in the later period, this reliance on philanthropy colored, for good and for bad, much of the image of those first colonists in the intra-Zionist imagination and these debates. Even Theodor Herzl, who we will discuss in the next session, famously remarked in scorn that these early colonists were no good and efficient, and described them as rich man's pastime to while away that would otherwise have been idle hours. This is also my opportunity to say a few words about the literature and historiography. And there is indeed a vast literature, at least in Hebrew, about the subject. But much of it is either focusing on economy and geography or suffers from a slightly parochial navel-gazing, seeing it only in a very local context, divorced from broader issues and global context, and shying away from debates about settler colonialism. So I would like to use this opportunity to plug in and recommend two books. And on purpose, I am contrasting here a very old book and a new one, dealing with the same issue, both written outside Israel, and both are geared towards non-Israeli, non-necessarily Zionist crowd. And it can be a very interesting exercise if you'd like to read them side by side and see how they examine the same subject in different light and using a different tone and theoretical apparatus. The first old book is from 1978 and is called To Rothschild and the Land of Israel. It was written by the British historian Simon Schama, now Sir Simon Schama, as he was knighted by the queen. He's a prolific historian. One can describe him fairly enough as one of the most famous historians of our generation. And when he wrote this book, he was still relatively a young historian, teaching history at Cambridge University's Christ College, and it was one of the first deep dives into the archives of the Rothschild family. And Shama really wanted to refute the type of negative image and Herzl's charge I alluded to earlier, and he stressed, for instance, how Baron Edmund Rothschild is responding to the crisis of Russian Jewry we just discussed, and that his immediate concern in 1882 is for the sanctuary of Eastern European pogrom victims, and that is translated into total commitment to development of this kind of self-supporting, economically sustainable Jewish homeland. And I would also mention the fact that probably because he was a British historian, Shama was very committed to pay tribute to the somewhat forgotten British dimension in supporting this Zionism even before World War I, that is, before the British troops would occupy Palestine and the Ottoman Empire would collapse, and Palestine would turn into a mandate. The second, on the right side of the slide, second new book came out just now in 2021 by my colleague Liora Halpern, who is an American Jewish historian. She serves as the chair of Israel Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. And she takes a slightly different approaches, and she emphasizes how those colonies, the moshavot, have been regarded and also disregarded in the history of Zionism. And this is, if you'd like, an exercise in not only history but memory. She argues that the first aliyah became a symbol that was created and deployed only in retrospect, not in real time. And most of her book is actually not about what happened in those colonies in real time, but the commemorative practices developed later, especially during the 20s and onwards up to the 1960s. And she wants to show us how similar memory practices can be found in other settler colonies. And this is what she calls the politics of Zionist settler firstness. This is the old guard that came out just now. So you can see here a very interesting compare and contrast. Now, don't be confused and think that with the first aliyah, Jews were no longer residing in Russia, though we see the Pale of Settlement being depopulated due to the waves of immigration. If we switch our view to Russia at the same time, we see that meantime those who did not immigrate as we enter into the early years of the 20th century before World War I, we see that the situation becomes even more dire. It continues to deteriorate, and this is where we reach perhaps the key events that we will discuss today, the Kishinev Pogrom. So what was the Kishinev Pogrom? This was the name that was given to anti-Jewish riots that took place in the city of Kishinev, that was then the capital of the Bessarabia Governorate in the Russian Empire, during 2 days, April 19 and 20, 1903. In this zoom in the map, you can see where the city is located. And it's very important to separate historical fact from fantasy here. During these 2.5 or 3 days of violence, 49 Jews were killed, 600 raped or wounded, while more than 1,000 Jewish-owned houses and stores were ransacked and destroyed. Don't confuse this with a second, smaller riot that also took place in Kishinev that erupted in October 1905 that would be also called the Kishinev Pogrom. The timing, again, is crucial. April. It's a pre-Easter attack, and it brings back immediately memories of blood libels and the religious antagonism between Jews and their Russian Orthodox neighbors as part of that context. I will have to give you a trigger warning because what we are about to see are several images many of you might find very disturbing. This is some of the historical footage that appeared in print in real time and was disseminated in Western media. And I'm bringing it here not to shock you or disgust you, but to say something very different. That thanks to the modern photography and journalism that allowed taking such photos and disseminating them, audience outside Russia was also shocked as we are shocked looking at these images now. The violence events were recounted in lurid detail by newspapers throughout the Western world. You will see an outcry in Britain, and Russia is described as evil and dark. It was covered sensationally in the US, primarily by America's Hearst press. And throughout these, thanks to these mediums, you will see the attacks sort of seize the imagination of an international public. And this is why this specific event came to be regarded, if you'd like, as the prototype of what we consider to be a pogrom. Despite the fact that there will be pogroms and very violent attacks before 1903 and much more hideous attacks after that, it was seen as kind of the embodiment of what we think of when we talk about a pogrom. You can see here also the cover of a recent book by the acclaimed historian Steven Zipperstein from Stanford University. And Zipperstein's book tells the story of Kishinev in the Kishinev pogrom in great detail. But much more important, this is a very important book that separates the facts from the exaggeration. It's a very diligent work. And this should be trotted very carefully, exactly because the pogrom was seen as so horrific. In retrospect, people started exaggerating and seeing it almost as preparing the ground for the Holocaust itself. And the problem here is not only, of course, the huge difference in scale. 49 dead is horrible, but there's nothing to be compared with the annihilation of 6 million using gas chambers, but also because there's the question of the pogrom didn't know how to have this master plan that we call a final solution, and also because part of what you see in 1903 is the type of ripple effect that Zipperstein describes extremely efficiently. He shows how different people and different organizations responded in different ways to those horrible news, and this has provided an impetus for efforts that were extremely diverse, as varied hideously as, on the one hand, anti-Jewish conspiracy texts such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the U.S. civil rights organization, the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, that was formed in 1909 against the background of these horrific events. So if you would like, what you see here is that 1903 becomes also a key year, not less important than 1882. If sometimes historians like to use the term annus mirabilis, a miraculous year, to describe a year in which many events or many important publications took place at the same time. If you'd like, 1903 is this annus horribilis, a horrible year. And you will see that immediately after the April attacks on the Jews of Kishinev, you will see different texts emerging. One of them is, of course, Chaim Nachman Bialik's famous text that emerged in this background. Why is it published? Bialik was sent to Kishinev from Odessa by the Odessa Historical Committee to collect testimonies from the victims who survived these attacks. In that same year, we see the Irish journalist I've mentioned earlier, Michael Davitt, coming to tell the story and coining the term Pale in his book Within the Pale. And this is where we see the first appearance of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was first published in Russian newspapers. It was serialized in a newspaper called Znamya, the banner, and later on reproduced anonymously. Only in recent years you will see historians actually identifying the author. And the media event, as I called it, had a huge impact way beyond Russia. And here you can see another, if you'd like, example of how people responded to the Kishinev program, even if they were not present in Russia at the time. Here you see Herman S. Shapiro's The Kishinev Shchita, Elegy, the Kishinev Massacre, a musical composition commemorating the pogrom that was released in 1904. And this is, again, shows you the type of global awareness to that pogrom. And the elegy gave a musical expression to New York audience to the Jews' outcry to this infamous pogrom. The music-loving students among you are welcome if you'd like to write your papers on this piece that was under research. You can find the original primary sources in the sheet music just across the street from us at the wonderful collection of Yiddish American popular sheet music located at the Library of Congress. Almost, again, an entirely forgotten musical piece, in a way was eclipsed by the famous poem by Bialik we will discuss shortly. Here you can see the zoom in on the cover image that gives you also a clue as to how these events were imagined by American audience and American Jews at the time. And you think about the names of the songs that were included in this musical piece: The First Signal of the Storm, The Helpless in Despair, The Bugle Call of the Rioters, The Victims Are in Their Agonies, and so on and so forth. You can see also the imagery of storm and so on that allude to the Russian term pogrom, as if it's a thunder or a natural event. Another example, if you'd like, here an artistic reaction by Abel Pan. The painting The Day After the Pogrom, A Courtyard with Ruins and a Bereaved Family. It's also a painting from the same year, 1903. Abel Pan was a very young painter at the time. He was born only in 1883 in what was today would be considered Latvia. And this was part of his, if you'd like, capstone project as a student in an art academy he studied in at the time. So he's not an account of an eyewitness. He was miles away, but he was shocked, probably just like us, and probably by seeing the same horrific images in the newspapers. Now, you will see here that they decided not to describe the violence itself, but its aftermath, and one can wonder why he does that. Perhaps he leaves you with the task of imagining the horror itself. Think about it when you will read Bialik's poem that is not exactly doing the same thing. He is describing the atrocities themselves. Just to conclude our discussion of that painting, Pan, though he moved later to study art in Paris, would become a Zionist. In 1912, he immigrated to Palestine, settled in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem, and he would teach art in the new founded Betzalel Academy of Art that was founded in mandatory Jerusalem under another famous Jewish Zionist artist named Boris Schatz. So if you'd like, this is also a painting that you can see here prepares the ground for Zionist kind of a imaginary of Eastern Europe and their past. So, of course, we've mentioned these various artistic expressions and reactions to the event, but of course they are all eclipsed by Bialik's City of Slaughter that was written originally in the Hebrew, which is a very important fact. It is entitled Be'ir HaHariga. The fact he can write it in Hebrew is related to topics we've discussed in the past about the Russian Jewish Haskalah, but it was also read in many other languages in translation, and most importantly, it was translated almost immediately into Yiddish, and meaning that it's available to the East European Jewish masses. And here you can see the cover of the Yiddish collection Tsar und Sturm, Sorrow and Rage in translation. And this is the book that includes in Shechita Shotot. This is the Yiddish version of Bialik's poem. So we are reaching now the last third of our recording today, and let's switch gears now and dive into the primary sources associated with our class today. And I would just want to say a few words of background that will help you read these sources more carefully. So the first group was asked to read the poem by Yehuda Leib Gordon, also known as Yalag in his Hebrew acronym, who was perhaps one of the most important Hebrew poets of the Jewish Russian Haskalah. He had a fascinating life story. He was born in Vilnius in Lithuania, and he began studying European culture and languages. He spoke Russian, German, Polish, French, even English at a very young age. But at his early 20s, he already graduated from government's teachers seminary in Vilna, and in the 1850s he began teaching career and started publishing poetry and to write satirical stories, fables, polemic essays in various periodicals, and in which was already urging for the revival of the Hebrew language. So again, like Bialik, here you have another Russian Jew writing in Hebrew way before the Zionist movement was established and outside Palestine. And he strongly denounced any prejudice against the Jews. He was fighting the religious conservatives of his time in the reactionary leadership, and he saw himself as sort of a spokesperson or an advocate for the Jews in general, and also for the Jewish women and the poor and the oppressed. And in 1865, he became the principal of the Hebrew Public School of Telz and established even another school. And in the 70s, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he started having a political power because he served as the secretary to the Jewish community and director of a society for the promotion of culture among Jews. That was a very important organ for disseminating Haskalah ideas. Very quickly, the authorities looked at him in an unfavorable eye, and he was jailed for alleged anti-Tsarist activities. And though he was exonerated in 1880, and returned to St. Petersburg, that had an impact on him. And he continued his work as editor of a very important Hebrew language daily from St. Petersburg. If you're interested to hear reading more, I would definitely recommend Michael Stanislavski's famous and excellent biography that its title alludes to Gordon's famous poem, For Whom Do I Toil? So the first poem I've asked you to take a look at is the 1866 poem Awake My People that was published in the Hebrew language magazine HaKarmel. And my prompt for you when reading this poem is to think about who is the people, who is the audience he has in mind, the readers that he is addressing his poem to, what does he mean by awakening, and to what extent you see him promoting his politics and ideology through this poetic lens. And I will just mention that, of course, most scholars would suggest that Yehuda Leib Gordon, at least at that time, was first and foremost a proponent of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. And even the pathos of a poem like Awake My People shows you how he wants to advocate these values. The poem was seen at the time and used later on almost as a rallying cry for the people not to immigrate to Palestine, but to reach their potential as both Jews and Russian. So it's a program of becoming well versed and educated in order to integrate into a Russian society that he hopes would also modernize himself. And the image you can see here, taken from the Evo Institute's rich archives, almost illustrates that image of Yehuda Leib Gordon. You can see here a series of Russian Jewish masculine, the followers of the Enlightenment, and Yehuda Leib Gordon is on the top right here as part of that kind of a famous pantheon of Russian masculine. So reading this, keep that in mind. But then the story becomes much more interesting if we move fast forward only 5 years later on to 1871, when he publishes a poem, the poem "For Whom Do I Toil?" And that is already a poem, I would suggest, that expresses a very different sentiment. Gordon already suddenly sees himself almost as a last Mohican, asking who would be the next person to read my poem if I am writing it in Hebrew. So this kind of a transition to modernity, the idea, the very fact he's expressing his ideas in Hebrew, if it was seen as a source of great optimism 5 years earlier, suddenly here he presents himself as almost the last poet of Zion. So again, I would ask yourself, I would ask you to think about what explains in your idea that transformation. Now, the theory of slaughter. As I've mentioned, in 1903, Bialik finds himself in Kishinev itself because it was commissioned to join an investigation team that was sent to the city and to collect testimonies. And from this came the long poem I've asked the second group to read, Be'ir HaHariga, in the city of slaughter. Now, this is a poetic description which does not necessarily correspond one-on-one with the report, the very dry data that Bialik himself collected in the testimonies, and historians have these records and they can compare and contrast these testimonials, right? So the poem, rather than those dry reports, was the one that made the big effect on a larger crowd and became also the text that people will return to time and again in later stages in history. In particular, what is important to remember how the poem shocked its readers, not only because of the horrific descriptions of violence, but also because of the power of the condemnation that you see here coming from Bialik's mouth, and the behavior of the Jewish victims themselves. Sometimes it seems as if he is angry at the Jews, not less than their oppressors. The effect of that poem cannot be exaggerated. American readers that might compare it with Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, in the sense that the series moral and political claims and the artistic work helped to bring a burning political problem into a larger crowd and had an immediate and lasting impact later on. But the magnitude in the context of Zionism cannot be underestimated as well. This long is commonly seen as the motivating force behind the formation of self-defense groups among Jews in Russia after the pogroms, as well as one of the factors for the rise of the second wave of immigration, the second aliyah, that starts in 1904. And some would even argue that this is, in a way, the ethos of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. In the same way I've used a trigger warning before the horrific images we saw, I would use a similar trigger warning needed before entering Bialik's poem, because he is describing many horrific images. He writes very graphically. Some would even argue too graphically about things such as the spattered blood and the dried brains of the dead. He could describe the facial expression and the smashed skull of a dead man with his nostrils nailed, the skull bones bashed and spilled, and even the smell, the stench of decaying bodies. But above all, he is furious. And I would argue that if he is furious at someone, the first subject he's angry at is God himself. For the God called up the slaughter and the spring together, the slayer slew, the blossom burst, and it was sunny weather. See how in the poem the poet almost compares the violence to those seasons or kind of a natural effects, again alluding to what we've mentioned earlier when discussing the term pogrom. And he is angry at what he considers to be also the passivity of the Jewish men hiding under the beds while their sisters, mothers, and spouses are raped before them. And listen to the resounding stanza, how he orders us as readers to look at the horrors and imagine the sexual violation. Listen then to the cellars of town. There were the virginal daughters of thy folk were folded, where 7 heathen flung a woman down, the daughter in the presence of her mother, the mother in the presence of her daughter, before slaughter, during slaughter, and after slaughter. Watching from the darkness and its mesh, the lustrous ray portioning for booty, their kindred and their flesh. Now these are very disturbing images and phrases, but they inserted a very powerful sentiment and a vocabulary into the stream of Zionist discourse. And I would even argue that this would make an appearance time and again years after 1903. So to conclude today's lecture with an illustration of my argument, and the power of poetry, I would take us fast forward from 1903 to Israel 111 years later in 2014, more than a century after the Kishinev pogrom. What you see on the left are the photos of 3 Jewish Israeli teenagers who were hitchhiking from to their homes from the yeshiva high school that they studied in the Israeli settlement of Alon Shvut in the West Bank. It was a terrorist attack against settlers in the West Bank, and the 3 were kidnapped on June 12, 2014. They were killed. But it took 2 very long and dramatic weeks for the search teams to find the bodies of the 3 missing teenagers thrown in a field northwest of Hebron. They were found only on June 30. On the right side of the slide, you can see the portrait of the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, who accused the Hamas for the kidnapping. And he gave a speech at the Israeli cabinet, and the speech is very much connected to action, but on the one hand, but is also tied to the Zionist historical imagination on the other hand, and this is what matters here. And the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech in the opening of the special cabinet meeting began by quoting Bialik in the following way. Here is my verbatim translation, and it reads as follows. I would like to say to the dear families, our hearts are bleeding, the whole nation is weeping with you. We will bring our boys to the grave of Israel. The vengeance of our small child's blood, Satan himself never dreamed. Hamas is responsible, Hamas will pay. Now, the key sentence here that is taken from Bialik is the vengeance for a small child's blood. Satan himself never dreamed. In the Hebrew original, Nikmat dam yeled katan, od lo bara hasatan. Now, this sentence became a catchphrase, but it was also completely divorced from context when it was suddenly inserted into the Israeli political discourse in the summer of 2014. Ariel Hirschfeld, a prominent Israeli literary critic and an expert on Bialik, was shocked by Benjamin Netanyahu's speech. How could the prime minister do such a thing? Call for a crude blood vengeance. How could he provide such a partial quote, omitting from Bialik the first crucial part of the same stanza, where Bialik himself says, Arur ha'omer nekom, and cursed be he who says avenge. Right? So in a way, what you see here that is that how Benjamin Netanyahu took this phrase without the warning. In other words, through a very selective use of Bialik's poem, Prime Minister Netanyahu changed the meaning of the phrase in the poem almost 180 degrees, from the prohibition, "thou shalt not revenge or avenge," to the affirmative, "you must revenge." And here is an expert from Hirschfeld op-ed that appeared in the Israeli daily Haaretz in my very crude translation. The extraordinary power of literature and poetry is revealed here as it emerges from the mouth of politicians. By reciting such a magnificent quote from The City of Slaughter, Netanyahu supposed that he was expressing noble feelings, as if he was delivering a eulogy, elevating the awful moments in the lives of the bereaved families, who did not ask for revenge and certainly never demanded a terrible war. But the attempt to utilize the great poem for political purposes is equivalent to the desire to harness lightning's power to illuminate a room. The poem pulled out from the Prime Minister's mind a series of connotations and hidden connections extending far beyond his conscious intention. According to that mind, first, what was done to us by the Palestinians is a pogrom, one long, continuous pogrom from Kishinev through Auschwitz to this day. Second, that what was done to the bereaved family was done to the whole nation and is essentially a slaughter. Third, that despite having a strong state and an army, we the Israelis, if you only scratch the surface, remain in a state of constant exile. And fourth, that the state of Israel is the answer of an ostracized people to its historical torturers. And finally, that what is done to us is not local, specific, or concrete, but is eternal, immense, and mythological. This has appeared in Haaretz in November 7th, 2014. Now, for full disclosure, Ariel Hirschfeld was one of my high school teachers, but I brought this excerpt not only to provide you with a snapshot of the way in which contemporary Israeli liberal intelligentsia seeks to speak truth to power, but also because I believe it demonstrates exceptionally well the power of literature and the force of images. I admire my colleagues in political science departments that study deadly ethnic violence, but they would rarely admit that you should treat poetry as something which is more than an ornament, as something that has power in expressing a sentiment and could be used in that in very different contexts. I would also want to allude to bring to your attention the way in which also Ariel Hirschfeld, whether consciously or not, used the image of a thunder or lightning that, again, we opened our discussion with earlier today. So how did these calls for revenge ended? You probably know the answer if you watched the the television miniseries Our Boys, Hane'arim, an American-Israeli production, which is based on true events. It ended up in a kidnap and a killing of an innocent Palestinian teenagers in July 2014, just 2 days after the bodies of the 3 Jewish boys were discovered. The perpetrators were 3 Jews, 2 of whom were minor, very cruel murder. Again, the body was thrown in a forest, this time in the outskirts of Jerusalem. So sadly now the Palestinians can also recite Bialik's poem out of context and talk about the vengeance of small child's blood. In this morbid note, we end today. Be well, do good work, and I look forward to our class discussion.